Florida and Louisiana and other places, when people come back, when the floodwaters recede and people come back, the real challenge turns out not to have been the hurricane, but the developers and profiteers that roll in after, and a recovery often becomes retooled and co-opted to serve their interests rather than the interests of residents.
Aloha, I'm Robert Perkinson, director of the Better Tomorrow Speaker Series and a professor at the University of Hawaii at Manoa. The Better Tomorrow Speaker Series is a joint venture of Kamehameha Schools and Hawaii Community Foundation and UH. And our guest today is award-winning author and celebrated community organizer Saket Soni. He is the author of The Great Escape, about the struggle to break up one of the largest labor trafficking rings in American history in the wake of Hurricane Katrina. As you will learn in the book, which you should read, he is an inexhaustible, improvisational, relentless, and compassionate and incredibly effective community organizer. He is also a visionary who is helping us think about how to bring justice to a whole new sector of the American economy, disaster response. And he is the founder of Resilience Force, which is a national organization that's kind of reimagining what labor unions and self-help and disaster nonprofits can be. He is a force of nature, just the sort of person we need for the forces of nature that climate change has unleashed. Thank you so much for joining us, Saket.
Thank you. Thank you. Great to be here, Robert.
I'm struck that you point out that disaster response once upon a time was something that contractors and government agencies did occasionally, but now it's become kind of a pillar of the economy, permanent. What do you mean by that?
Yeah, as climate change has become a powerful force, disasters have become more frequent and more destructive. In the United States, although there have been disasters for a very long time, the first one that was truly on the national consciousness in a very, very big way was Hurricane Katrina, about 20 years ago, almost 20 years ago. Since then, there have been more and more destructive and frequent hurricanes, floods, and fires, to the point where we spend $100 billion or more a year on disaster recovery. This money comes from insurance companies. It comes from FEMA and other government agencies. Each year, thousands, if not tens of thousands of Americans lose their homes to disaster. And so repairing these homes, just that, not to mention the roads, the schools, the broader cities, that has become big business. And just an indication of that is after Hurricane Katrina, a lot of the companies that used to do the repairs were small mom and pop shops. Today, they are construction firms that are worth hundreds of millions of dollars. Some of them are owned by private equity firms on Wall Street. So this has really become a rising part of the economy. It's an economy, in fact, that we call the resilience economy.
Another thing you point out is that, of course, we all know the destructive force that floods and hurricanes and fires can bring, and that those are more likely and more severe in the climate crisis. The government and the nonprofit efforts are supposed to help those communities recover and rebuild. Tragically, your research suggests and your work suggests that recovery can, in a way, make things worse, or they can make whole people who went into the disaster insured and well-to-do and really make inequalities worse. That's a provocative claim that you sometimes even frame it as recovery for some can be amount to robbery.
Yeah, we're used to the idea that disasters hit different for different kinds of people. We're used to the idea that poor people are hurt more by disaster than the wealthy. That's absolutely true, and that's very intuitive. What's counterintuitive is that recoveries can hurt the poor. That recoveries actually do help the already wealthy. They help those who have resources. And in fact, those who are wealthy come out a lot wealthier after the recovery. But the poor become poorer. Recovery can actually disadvantage those who were at a disadvantage before the disaster. When I say recovery is robbery, I mean that disaster recovery has become a hidden driver of inequality. People of color, homeowners who are Black or Latino, renters, the uninsured, the underinsured, all of these people are left worse off, not just through the disaster, but through the recovery, while the already wealthy gain advantage.
How does, in a nutshell, resilience force enter into this dynamic in hopes of improving it?
Well, one disaster that we're working on right now is a small hurricane in the scheme of things that hit Louisiana last month. It hit a place called Morgan City. And Morgan City is, it's about an hour and a half from New Orleans. It's an old shrimp and petroleum town. And most of the residents who were hit are uninsured or underinsured. And you can see this, that it's only been now a month or so, a month and change since the hurricane. But even in the course of a single month, people who started off poor are actually poorer. People who started off, at a disadvantage are at a deeper disadvantage. And it's all in the way that recovery has played out, even in the course of 6 weeks. So, for example, there's a family that I know that got about 3 inches of water in their home as a result of the hurricane. Now, it was a hot month in Louisiana, and this family's insurance company told them that despite the fact that they'd been with that insurance company for 60 years, paying the same insurance company, the insurance company could not pay out for that kind of water damage. It wasn't covered.
That happened to my grandparents lost their house in Katrina. They had been there for 40 years, and they hadn't checked the box of automatically increasing the value insured. So they got the value of what everything would have been in the 1970s.
This is almost exactly what's happening to some of these families. The family I'm talking about, they've had their house. It's one of the 3 original houses on that street, and they've had their house in that family for since 1942. So this is the 4th generation in that house. And at the point where the insurance doesn't cover it, then this family applies to FEMA. But from the point of the hurricane to the time when FEMA arrives, that house grows moldier and moldier. The mold spreads not only in the walls but in the roof. And by the time the help arrives, that whole house has to be gutted. So now this family has lost the house in the time the help could arrive. As a result, to repair the house, the family now will have to move out and live in a nearby hotel. They'll have a much longer commute to work, and they'll bleed money getting to their own jobs. Right. So this is the way that recovery can actually make people fall down the rungs of the economy. What we're doing is we're at the doors. When a disaster hits, we're talking to residents. We're getting a really granular sense of what they need. We're not just case managing their needs, but we're building a social movement out of those needs to get to a more equitable recovery, a recovery that's racially just, that benefits not just the wealthy, but the poor, not just people in cities, but in rural communities, not just white homeowners, but homeowners who are people of color or renters. And we're trying to make sure that there are policy changes so that recoveries respond to poor people better. The other thing we do is build the workforce that the recovery needs. All of these disasters created an enormous, extraordinary labor need. People who live in these homes need them repaired immediately, and people need long-term recovery. And we're building workforces so that the workers who are rebuilding come from inside those communities, so that jobs can stay in those communities.
Let's go back to the genesis of this work in disasters. You grew up in Delhi, were a theater student and literature student in Chicago and a theater manager, and then you sort of switched directions to community organizing. And then, after Katrina, you up and moved to Louisiana and started a workers center there. I guess first, why did you do that? And secondly, what did you learn about the sort of workers who were rushing in to help, and what does their experience tell us about their experience, their conditions tell us about disasters?
Well, I was a theater major in college. I arrived to go to the University of Chicago on a scholarship from India. My parents were the only parents, perhaps, in the history of Indian civilization to let their son go to the United States to study theater.
You didn't claim you were going to medical school, and just
I didn't. They somehow were okay with it, and I was that's what I was doing in Chicago. I was running a theater company when 9/11 happened, and right before then, I had become undocumented. I missed an immigration deadline.
Oh, that's
and
bad.
So
I'm undocumented.
Yes, so I became undocumented right before 9/11, and after 9/11 became a low-wage worker myself, working in kitchens and car washes, a few weeks on a cruise ship, doing a whole set of odd jobs with side by side with other immigrant workers. And then when I got my papers back after that, I was pretty clear that I wanted to be a community organizer. I didn't quite learn what that meant until Hurricane Katrina happened. I was in Chicago organizing renters on the north side of Chicago when all of a sudden on the news we started watching, and the levees broke and floodwaters poured in, and we were watching the government response. And the people I was organizing in Chicago were Southerners. They were people who had come to Chicago, or their families had come as a result of the Great Migration,
right,
from Louisiana and Mississippi and Arkansas. These were older renters, elders in their communities. And I watched the hurricane response after Katrina through their eyes. And I realized how much I didn't know, the gap in my knowledge about the United States, and that I had to go to the South. So I went there for 10 days as a relief worker, intending to stay 10 days. And I ended up staying the better part of 15 years.
Yeah, you're still there.
I'm still there, yeah.
And what did you discover about, I mean, there's a lot of attention paid to the people who are dispossessed and displaced by disasters, but maybe less attention to the kind of challenges that workers face who come in to help. What are some of those challenges that frontline, first line, not emergency responders, but emergency rebuilders and cleaners face?
Well, when I got to New Orleans, my days would often start at 5 a.m. At this site of hiring where lots and lots of workers would gather. We would all stand in the morning under a 60-foot tall monument to Robert E. Lee in the middle of New Orleans, a place called Lee's Circle. And hundreds of workers would gather there, and they were mostly migrant workers. The local people were still reeling. They were out of their homes.
Right.
Many were, in neighboring states, all the way in Houston or in Atlanta, and some are as far out as San Francisco and Colorado, trying to make their way back. Meanwhile, the Gulf Coast had turned into the world's largest construction site. There were 1 million homes to be rebuilt in Louisiana, 1 million more in Mississippi. And this rebuilding was really getting done by migrant workers who had come from other states and other countries, many of whom were undocumented, many of whom had worked in restaurants and kitchens and construction sites all over the country, and were now standing under that statue, climbing onto buses driven by contractors, and getting driven out to dark and distant corners of the Gulf Coast to rebuild. And I'd hop on with them onto those buses, and I'd follow them, and I watched the recovery take place. And what I saw was that while local people, the people who lived there, mostly African Americans, were locked out of the rebuilding, while they faced obstacles even from re-entering the city they called home, these migrant workers were locked into exploitative conditions. They were, they were often working without protective equipment. They were inhaling toxic fumes of the buildings they were repairing. They were often sleeping in the homes that they were rebuilding.
Wow.
Because they had nowhere else to sleep, or they were living in encampments across the city that were often, just a matter of a dozen tents in the mud where workers were sleeping. And that's what I was doing when I got a phone call from one worker in Mississippi who led me to what ended up becoming one of the largest human trafficking in modern U.S. history. So that's how badly workers were being treated.
Not paid overtime, or sometimes not paid at all. It sounds like wage theft was also
not
real.
paid at all. And often when workers would come forward to ask for pay, contractors would call immigration police on them. Workers would be deported on payday. Those were, some of the conditions.
So you're working to provide assistance or mediation or leverage to these workers one by one.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and then you get pulled into this case that changes your life. How did that come out?
A gentleman called me in the middle of the night one night, and I was used to getting phone calls from all over the Gulf Coast. I was used to workers calling me, often African American or white workers if they were local, or Latino workers if they were migrants. But this worker was special because he spoke in Hindi. He was from India. And I gathered that he had come all the way from India to someplace in Mississippi to work for a company he was too scared to name. He was too afraid to tell me his own name. Wanted to remain anonymous. And what I imagined was that perhaps he and a few others, had been brought on a tourist visa to work for a relative who owned a restaurant.
Mm-hmm.
We had seen these kinds of cases before in Texas and California. So in my mind, as he was describing his situation, I was imagining that, I would meet 3 people in the basement of a restaurant or in a trailer behind a restaurant, working for little or nothing, for their uncle, perhaps. This call was followed by another and a third, and I convinced these 3 gentlemen to meet with me. They didn't want me to come to their workplace, but they said that I could meet with them clandestinely in a church, because whoever their employer was allowed them on Sunday to go to a nearby Catholic church. That was their little envelope of freedom every week. They lived on company property, but were allowed to make a chaperone visit to a church. So they proposed that I go to the church pretending to be a parishioner, and after we prayed, I would accidentally bump into them. And since I was from India and they were from India, we'd have a conversation. And in that conversation, they'd let me know what their situation was. They didn't know exactly what the name of the church was. They told me it was called the Secret Catholic Church. And so it took a drive through Mississippi to find it. I drove around, and my coworkers and I, and we found it. And it was, in fact, in their very particular English, they were describing the Sacred Heart Catholic Church in Pascagoula, Mississippi.
Right.
That's a place you know.
Yeah. My mom graduated from high school there.
What was her experience like?
Her family got kind of run out of Jackson, Mississippi for being in favor of civil rights, and Pascagoula was a little more liberal than Jackson in the civil rights era. So
I take it your family were not shipping tycoons.
no,
They weren't shipyard owners.
no, but they did go to high school with them.
So your neighbors and your mom's friends probably have some connection on this company I discovered. So I discovered that well, first of all, when I got to the Secret Catholic Church, I was supposed to meet with 3 men in the back room of this church, and I opened the door, and instead of 3 men, there were almost 100 waiting for me. 100 people from India, and I thought, how on earth did you get here? And it turned out that they had been brought by a large oil rig manufacturer.
Yeah, this was a big, elaborate, complex, multinational scheme.
Yes, agents and recruiters for a large-scale, private equity-owned oil rig manufacturer had gone to India after Hurricane Katrina. The hurricane had washed away their workforce. Workers were beginning to come back, but the company had a long line of lucrative contracts in the wings, and they wanted to get right back to work. So instead of gathering their local workers, figuring out how to provide workforce housing for people who were struggling to get back on their feet, they wanted to get 3 times the work done at a third the price. They went to India and they recruited welders and pipe fitters in India, and they sold them an American dream. They told them that they could come on green cards and that they would make a life for themselves in America. That after they worked for a certain amount of months, they would become permanent residents and could eventually bring their families. And for this, the company and its recruiters charged them $20,000 apiece. Now that's generations of savings in India. People sold ancestral land. They put homes on the hawk. They mortgaged homes. They pawned jewelry to gather the money and paid up.
All for this, what was supposed to be the opportunity of a lifetime.
It turned out to be an American nightmare. People were dropped into a labor camp on company property. They were working 12-hour shifts back to back. So the company had itself a round-the-clock workforce. They were living 24 to a trailer in sardine box-like trailers. They were constantly surveilled. They were behind barbed wire fences.
Problems, sewage backups. It sounds like
the labor camp itself was built on a toxic waste ground, a toxic dumping ground that was supposed to be sealed off to protect the environment. Instead, trailers were erected on it, and the legs of those trailers broke the seal. So people were breathing in God knows what. And when they came forward to report abuse, when the company discovered that a small group of workers was meeting with them, the company sent guards to conduct a pre-dawn raid on their own workforce and attempted to deport the activists.
But in kind of a feat of organizing both among the welders, and with your help and a team on the outside, somehow you managed to get almost everyone to kind of escape.
Yeah, that's right.
in Mass, which is a very dramatic story.
Yes, you know, the Great Escape, that that is the title of the book, um, refers to this incredible sort of stealth campaign that these workers took on. One of the most courageous things I've ever seen people do in my life. That these workers gathered and decided in stealth to escape from this labor camp. Um, and I'm not going to give too much away about how that happened, but it involved a lot of wild turkey as bribes to labor camp guards, a lot of flavored cigars to sweeten the deal, and a highly elaborate but quite fictional Indian wedding as a pretext to get 500 men out of the labor camps. And then they set out on a freedom journey to get justice from the Department of Justice.
Yeah, which turned out to be harder than you would think with this amazing story that getting the Department of Justice to investigate with the Civil Rights Division of the would be kind of a straightforward endeavor, but it took a whole nother campaign.
It did. The men thought it would be a straightforward endeavor, especially because they came from India. They had more faith in American institutions than those of us living here.
I see.
They thought that the Department of Justice would just grant them, humanitarian visas that are designated for trafficking survivors because they escaped the labor camp. In fact, they would say to me, "It's all in the name. It's called the Department for Justice." That's what they called it. We didn't know at the time that deep inside the federal government, there were corrupt officials that had their own private reasons to collude with the company, and that they were running a cover-up. And so we were up against law enforcement officials who had been in deep collusion with the company for a very long time, and were working against the men's campaign, not just to limit what they got from the Department of Justice, but to incarcerate and deport them.
For ending up without papers or with their visas expired.
That's right. That's right.
Okay, so they march all the way to Washington, D.C. from Pascagoula, Mississippi, or from New Orleans, I guess at that point. They engage in a hunger strike.
Yeah.
What finally breaks through and enables them to get, most of them do get kind of trafficking victims visas and ultimately a settlement.
Yes. So there was a gentleman who was one among these 500 workers who had just been married before he left India on this visa. He expected to be reunited with his wife in 9 months. She conceived right before he left. He was expecting to meet his newborn son. This gentleman didn't wind up seeing his son for another 3 years.
Jeez.
But the book does end well. The men did, as a result of their incredible courage and the help of many others, they did wind up defeating the ICE agents on the prowl that were embedded in the government and in collusion with the company. And so there is a scene right at the end of this beautiful reunion between this young man and his wife, and his son that his wife is carrying leaps into his arms, and so that did happen. It took a lot longer than it should have, and I thought the story was over. What I didn't realize when I met these men was that they were actually among the first of many, many immigrant workers who would arrive from other states and other countries to repair and rebuild after disaster. And so what I thought was an ending was actually the beginning of a much long 15 to 20 year long story.
Right. Well, I mean, the book is amazing, and people should.
Thank you.
It really is it's a feat of writing to kind of tell the story of such a unspeakable injustice, but also, and not just kind of in a feel-good way, sentimental way, reach a just conclusion, but show just how difficult and iterative it is, the process of organizing and seizing justice rather than waiting for it to arrive.
Mm-hmm. With that.
But I guess as large as that struggle was, it seems like you concluded that it seemed like you'd been playing whack-a-mole with individual workers being exploited in New Orleans. Then you undertook this much larger case. But I presume the reason for founding resilience forces that you realized, like, if you were trying to save one group of workers at a time, we were never going to catch up.
Yeah,
you were going to run out of band-aids.
So. That's right. As disasters became more frequent, as floods and fires and hurricanes kept coming, more and more workers joined this new emerging workforce. This is what we call the resilience workforce. Each time a hurricane hit, workers would follow the storm, and I would follow the workers. And what I saw was that everywhere, these immigrant workers were gathering to become the white blood cells of recovery. They would come, they would heal, they would repair, but they themselves would be sleeping in cars in a Home Depot parking lot or on the floor of the Home Depot parking lot. They'd get up in the morning and wash themselves with bottles. They'd, sleep in moldy mattresses in the homes they were rebuilding. And they weren't just doing it once a year. Increasingly, they'd work 3 floods a year, and then 3 floods and 4 hurricanes a year. And then when the California fires started, workers would crisscross between coasts, going from flood to fire. Then there were Midwestern storms and tornadoes in Appalachia, and workers would drive out. I know a worker who, in the course of a single year, went to 12 different disasters, and logged them all on his phone. And so you have this new itinerant workforce that, much like farm workers of yesteryears, who would go from season to season, but mostly, would work 4 seasons at best a year. These workers would work half a dozen to a dozen disasters. And so we decided to recruit them all into one large industry-wide organization. So Resilience Force is an association of these workers. And we're protecting them, we're making them safe. But
like a union, but without one employer. Or
yeah, and unions in the United States largely are workplace based. So for example, the union of Amazon employees will organize workers in that Amazon warehouse. The challenge our workers have is they have 12 disasters a year, and each disaster is 35 workplaces.
Yeah, right.
So you really need an industry-wide approach to negotiate better practices across an entire industry.
Guilds once upon a time did that in a certain sense.
That's exactly what a guild is. Yeah. And in many ways, our members have that same sense of identity. The other thing guilds did was give people a sense of pride in their vocation. They were able to get mentors. They were able to practice their craft. Older bricklayers.
And you're trying to do that, right? Like create new official categories of work, training programs, special higher wages.
That's right. Yeah. One thing that I started noticing among these workers that was really remarkable was they weren't just doing this work for the money. They started to feel deeply connected to the residents who they were helping. Workers would come in and they were proud that through their work, recoveries were happening, that through their work, people were coming home.
As workers,
they would receive incredible expressions of gratitude from mayors, from homeowners. And so a sense of vocation started to form among these workers. And we started building not just a series of protective measures for these workers, but an entire apprenticeship program, training program, to to draw more and more people into this deep, sacred vocation, and to build out this workforce that we need in the climate era.
And if the workers are organized in advance, if they know their rights, they also have a sense of dignity and that they themselves have, but maybe a collective understanding that people should and must respect it.
That's right.
And you don't have to just help workers when they don't get paid overtime, but they're better able to kind of protect themselves, or at least.
That's right. So, for example, there's a worker named Josue Diaz. I met Josue when he was 17 years old. He had just walked from Honduras to New Orleans.
Wow.
A very long journey, and he did it on his own. And he did it because of political and economic circumstances back home that made him do what every human being does when your home becomes too dangerous to stay, right? You leave. He left. He wound up coming to the Gulf Coast just a week before a hurricane hit, Hurricane Gustav. And right after the hurricane, he stood up at a day labor corner and got picked up to go rebuild. He found himself in such atrocious conditions in a makeshift labor camp that he asked to be paid. He asked to be protected. He found himself not paid for weeks, not sure if he would be paid. When he came forward, he was 17. When he came forward, the employer called the police on him, and he wound up in jail. He was nearly
not holding papers
for being a whistleblower, in essence, without papers, right? Today, many, many years later, that was in 2009. Today, Josue is 30-something. He's a proud member of our organization, and he's one of the most experienced roofers in the Gulf Coast. He runs a huge crew, and he's mentoring and training new workers through our apprenticeship program. So that's the way people have this long professional arc that we're giving them.
That's amazing. I mean, it's also impressive, I think, that not only are you trying to set up this structure or this organizational framework for people to be organized, trained, protect themselves, these climate disaster technicians, but homeowners too, you argue, can benefit, or business owners who lose property. How can it be both a win for the workers and for the residents who have lost property?
Yeah, this is really interesting. So people like Josue, when they go and repair after hurricanes, they're doing a lot of work for residents who, right before the hurricane, thought of Josue as the enemy. We're deep in red states, deep in Trump country. And it's immigrant workers, many of whom are undocumented, who are arriving to rebuild the homes for homeowners who thought of immigrants as the enemy. And yet, because everybody's pulled together in the practical, problem-solving, mission,
right,
of repairing and rebuilding, bonds start to form. And so a couple of things are happening. One, homeowners realize they need the workers, right? But it goes beyond that transactional need. As people work together to solve these really difficult problems, they start to form friendships. They start to spontaneously connect. And one of the things we do is to turn these spontaneous moments of connection, meals being cooked, residents giving bottled water, residents opening up their homes to workers. We turn these spontaneous moments into deep, long-lasting friendships and connection. That's at the granular level. At the broader level, mayors and governors see that without these workers, homes will never be rebuilt. If homes aren't rebuilt, people will move away. If people move away, the tax base will evaporate, and municipalities will spiral into a state of collapse. So this starts to reverse some of the politics we see, that the politics of recovery and the deep need for rebuilding um, propel us into a kind of relationship with each other. One last thing is we also make sure that local people become part of this workforce.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, it starts a lot of times with immigrant workers, but as local people recover, they start to need new sources of livelihood. And so we train them to join the workforce.
Right, and if the conditions are better and the wages are better, then they might be also more
They can
attractive.
do that. That's right.
So on the ground, how does this work? Like a hurricane hit just as you were arriving in Hawaii, and then, like, what do you do day one?
Well,
Resilience force.
so back to Morgan City, Louisiana, actually, where we were for a month or so, that provides a little bit of an example. So, a hurricane hit Louisiana, and 2 days later, we were at the command center where the National Guard was handing out ice and tarp, and bottles of water. Deep inside this huge municipal auditorium, we found the mayor and his team. They were absolutely overwhelmed. A truck had rolled over them, right?
Yeah.
And when we explained to them what we do, they handed us a map, literally with 3 circles around it, where the flooding was. And in the next few days, the entire list of every resident who had called the city asking for help. As you can imagine, this is a city of 11,000 people.
Oh my gosh.
Right? And easily a third of the population had called for help.
Right.
The city was completely overwhelmed. In fact,
the police force has 10 people or something.
A little more.
Yeah.
Probably 50. But the police force itself was dealing with its own wreckage, right? So we became the foot soldiers. We went to every door. We trained local people to come with us to the doors. And as workers rebuilt homes and roofs and walls, gutted, waterlogged homes, repaired floors, we started to build connections with local people who wanted to enter that work. Now we're going to set out to train local people to join that workforce. We're bringing in contractors who can pay a fair wage. So that's all of the ways in which we can contribute to a recovery process.
And then what's different? Like, so at first you're knocking on doors. What are you doing or will be doing in a year on the ground in the same location?
Well, after disasters, cameras leave usually in 10 days, right? But the recovery lasts years. In fact, I know people who are just now starting to get their checks from FEMA or insurance companies 3 years after a hurricane hit in their hometown.
Wow.
So we go door to door to do a range of things. We sort of case manage residents. We help them navigate the array of recovery processes. We stick with them to make sure they get the money that they're eligible for to rebuild their lives. We train them to be their own advocate inside the recovery system. And then we also try to build a recovery economy in their city, a resilience economy that is not an economy of winners and losers. And one of the ways we do that is to build these resilience workforces that include them, that as people's jobs wash away, they're able to have these alternate livelihoods. In New Orleans, for example, where in the course of 3 years during the pandemic, Louisiana had 2 hurricanes. So this is a city that was facing not just the pandemic, which we all were facing, but 2 hurricanes on top of that. We built the city a year-round workforce that took people who had lost their jobs in the service economy, jobs that had been paying them $7.25 an hour. We retrained them as resilience workers to be community outreach workers, to be construction workers, and everything in between. And those workers, had gone from $725 an hour to earning $24 an hour in this new economy. So that's the intervention we make.
It's a little more than a year now since the catastrophic fires hit Lahaina, the worst modern wildfires in terms of human deaths in American history. And, for Hawaii, a small state and a little historic town, cataclysm. You've only been on the ground kind of meeting, but you've met with lots of people in Lahaina and Kala'ui and here on Oahu. What is your sense of the ways that the disaster response here has been similar or different from what you're seeing in other afflicted communities?
Well, there are major differences between hurricanes and floods on one hand and fires on the other. And one big difference is just there are few things as final as a fire. A hurricane comes and damages a house. A fire just wipes it away. There is nothing left. And that does present a pretty extraordinary rebuilding challenge. Lay that on top of other challenges, and then there are some similarities. What I've heard here is people are fundamentally worried not just about the physical act of rebuilding their homes, but whether they'll be able to afford to live, where they once lived.
Right. Whether a terrible housing crisis beforehand.
Right. How will the fire and the repair and recovery compound the housing crisis that people are living in? I've seen this again and again in Florida and Louisiana and other places. When people come back, when the floodwaters recede and people come back, the real challenge turns out not to have been the hurricane, but the developers and profiteers that roll in after. And a recovery often becomes retooled and co-opted to serve their interests rather than the interests of residents. And that's a justifiable fear. I think it's something I've heard a lot from a lot of people. We're in this, deeply special place where Native Hawaiians have, ancestral practices, deep traditions, a deep way of life, a relationship to the land, water.
Ways of managing the land, too, that would have not led to such fire risk.
Had those been followed. Yes, yeah. Absolutely. And so there is, an expertise that comes from all of that, and people want that expertise to be utilized in the recovery, justifiably so. They want a recovery that, rather than skipping all over that and fitting them into a cookie cutter, actually deeply benefits from harvesting all of that expertise. And I think that's true of other recoveries I've seen.
Just the local granular knowledge and traditions could be deployed in ways that sometimes the templates don't.
Yes,
facilitate.
Exactly. And local people who are repositories of that knowledge. And if we were to deeply listen and design recoveries around that knowledge, then it would be, in the long run, it would be not just a better recovery, but it would equip society to better prepare for the next disaster.
Are there some things that Hawaii seems to be doing rather well?
Well, I've had a chance to sit down with leaders of the recovery, everyone from those serving food at hubs to those, designing the broader recovery process. And it seems like one thing that's going well is just that, a lot of people are in touch with each other, in communication with
Yeah.
each other, coordinating with each other. Recoveries can be deeply divided, deeply polarized, um, and in an age of, you know, uh, of division, they can also be deeply politicized by outside interests. You've had you know uh, big hurricanes through the southeast in just in the last week, and uh, Trump has gone and tried to sort of profit politically, from recovery efforts for his own political momentum. Um, Here it seems that the immune system of people, in Maui has prevented that. It seems like there's a much deeper coordination and communication, which is really inspiring. I think there's also different kinds of infrastructure that seems to be built here. Uh, for example, the way that the Hawaii Community Foundation has really become this kind of broad uh, sort of uh, vehicle for resources in the recovery. Um, I've seen recoveries where, you know, dozens of different community foundations, each representing their city, um, struggles to collaborate and cooperate. Here, there's just one central hub that you can navigate for resources. And all of that is incredible. Maybe the most incredible thing is the deeper mission around the recovery, which to a T, everybody involved has told me that what they really want is not just to get back on their feet from this disaster, but to return to practices and ways of life that secure future generations from the many disasters to come. And I think that's very profound.
What are some, in this age of climate disaster, as terrifying as this is, the Lahaina fire is not likely to be an isolated event. We are vulnerable to hurricanes in lots of different ways, vulnerable to tsunamis, vulnerable to more additional fires. If one thing that has to happen is, you need to have actionable ancestral knowledge, you need to activate insiders instead of relying on outsiders. What are some steps that either community organizations or labor unions or government can take to, I know this is a big question, but some simple steps that they can take toward fostering a kind of preparatory resilience that might make us respond more nimbly than we could otherwise?
Well, one example of this is what we and others got together to build in New Orleans. After New Orleans became tragic ground zero for the pandemic, we worked to build this year-round workforce. And although this workforce came together to help get through the pandemic, it meant that they were ready for action when a hurricane came. There was a hurricane that hit Louisiana, and New Orleans lost power for, some people lost power for a week, some for 10 days. And that power outage usually would have been catastrophic, especially for people with disabilities or the houseless, or those in houseless because of the shelter population, right?
Mm-hmm.
Or the elderly. And as a result of having this workforce in place, we were able to quickly respond and organize through that disaster. So something similar here, where perhaps there was a statewide, but made of many localities, a continual year-round workforce that was able to spring into action when disasters occurred, but even before disasters was working year-round to prepare community, prepare the built environment, prepare the land for disasters to come. That might, that might make people more secure, but also more able to build a livelihood and a long-term career.
Fosters a richer local economy too.
That's right. It's both climate and economic resilience.
Right. Thank you so much, Saket, for your work and your thinking and your advocacy. It sounds like from your conversations here that you will be back and Resilience Force will be back, and there may be some collaborations that over time I can imagine may become quite robust. So
looking forward to it, Robert. Thank you for the invitation. Thanks for having me here. It's really incredible to speak to and learn from people here. So my honor, absolutely.
Thank you for coming and for listening. I want to thank all of the students and staff and video crew that makes all of this possible, and our sponsors of the Better Tomorrow series, Hawaii Community Foundation, who we've been talking about, Kamehameha Schools, that's also been really supportive of this work, and the University of Hawaii. And thank you all for joining us. We look forward to talking about these important issues more in the future. Mahalo.